Don't look back. A midnight passenger. The radio crackled with static as I guided my Subaru down the empty stretch of Route 17, somewhere in the backwoods of upstate New York. The clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m. Sarah, my best friend since basic training, was fighting sleep in the passenger seat beside me, her military cap pulled low over her eyes. We were both fresh out of Fort Drum, celebrating our graduation from advanced individual training with an impromptu road trip to my family's cabin in the Adirondacks. The November air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine through the cracked windows. Our Army combat uniforms still felt stiff and new, a reminder of everything we'd accomplished over the past several months. "You sure you don't want me to take over?" Sarah mumbled, straightening in her seat. "You've been driving for hours." I shook my head, enjoying the hypnotic rhythm of the yellow lines disappearing beneath my headlights. "I'm good. Something about night driving just clears my head, you know?" "Yeah, I get that." She stretched and checked her phone. "No service out here. Typical." The trees pressed close to the road, their branches forming a dark tunnel ahead. We hadn't passed another car in over an hour, and the only light came from my high beams cutting through the darkness. I liked it this way. Just the road, the night, and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. That's when we saw her. She appeared so suddenly in my headlights that I nearly swerved off the road. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, standing on the shoulder with her thumb out. She wore a plain white dress that seemed too thin for the cold night air, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. "Jesus!" Sarah sat up straight, fully awake now. "Where did she come from?" I slowed the car, my training kicking in. Someone alone on this road, at this hour, had to be in trouble. The woman's face was pale in my headlights, her expression unnaturally calm. "We should help her," I said, already pulling over. "She could freeze out here." Sarah nodded, though I caught the slight furrow of her brow. We were both trained to assess threats, and something about this situation felt off. But we were also soldiers, taught to help civilians in need. I stopped about 10 feet behind her and rolled down my window. "Hey there, are you okay?" The woman turned slowly, her movements oddly fluid. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly through the night air. "I need to get home. Can you help me?" Sarah and I exchanged glances. We were two trained soldiers. If this was some kind of trap, we could handle ourselves. I unlocked the back doors. "Hop in," I called out. "Where are you headed?" The woman glided, there's no other word for it, to the car and slipped into the back seat. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment she closed the door. In my rearview mirror, I could see her sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. "Just up ahead," she said. "I'll show you the way." I pulled back onto the road, trying to ignore the goosebumps rising on my arms. Sarah kept her hand near her hip, where I knew she had a tactical knife clipped to her belt. The woman in the back hadn't given us a name or explained why she was out here alone. She just sat there, unnaturally still, staring straight ahead. After about 10 minutes of silence, I cleared my throat. "So, what brings you out this way so late?" No response. I glanced in the rearview mirror again and felt my blood turn to ice. The woman's eyes were fixed on mine in the mirror, unblinking, and they seemed to be glowing with a faint phosphorescent light. Her skin had taken on a bluish tinge, and her lips were pulled back in what might have been a smile, but looked more like a grimace. Sarah must have seen my expression change because she turned to look at our passenger. The moment she did, she grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Katie," she whispered, "her feet..." I couldn't look away from the mirror, but Sarah's voice was trembling. "Her feet are backwards." The woman's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Turn here," she said, pointing to what looked like a solid wall of trees. "There's no road there," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, my headlights swept across a narrow dirt track I could have sworn wasn't there a second ago. "Turn here," she repeated, her voice taking on a strange, multi-toned quality that made my teeth ache. My hands seemed to move of their own accord, turning the wheel. Sarah grabbed the dash as we bumped onto the dirt road. "Katie, no! What are you doing?" I tried to straighten the wheel, to get back to the main road, but my arms wouldn't respond. The woman's eyes in the mirror had grown larger, filling more of the reflective surface than should have been possible. "Almost home," she said, and now her voice sounded like multiple people speaking in unison. "Mother is waiting." The dirt road wound deeper into the woods, the trees pressing closer until branches scraped against the sides of the car. My headlights illuminated a small clearing ahead, where a decrepit cabin sat in a pool of sickly yellow light. An old woman sat in a rocking chair on the porch, her hands moving in a steady rhythm as she worked at something in her lap. "Stop here," the woman in the back seat commanded, and again my body obeyed against my will. The old woman on the porch looked up, and I felt a scream building in my throat. Her face was a hollow mask, eye sockets empty and black, her mouth opening far too wide as she began to keen, a high, inhuman sound that made my vision blur. Sarah was the one who saved us. While I sat paralyzed behind the wheel, she ripped off her dog tags and thrust them at the woman in the back seat. "In the name of God and country, be gone!" the woman hissed, an actual serpentine hiss. And for a moment, I saw her true form in the mirror. Not a young woman at all, but something ancient and terrible, its skin hanging in rotting strips from a skull-like face. Sarah began reciting the soldier's creed, her voice strong and clear. "I am an American soldier. I am a warrior and a member of a team." The thing in the back seat shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and suddenly my arms were my own again. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt as I backed away from the cabin. The old woman on the porch stood, her rocking chair toppling, and I saw that she too was something else. Something with too many limbs, moving in ways that human joints shouldn't allow. I don't remember much about the drive back to the main road. Sarah kept reciting the soldier's creed over and over, while I focused on putting as much distance between us and that clearing as possible. When we finally reached Route 17 again, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. We drove straight through to the nearest town, found a diner, and sat in silence over cups of coffee that we didn't drink. Finally, Sarah spoke. "We're never talking about this again, right?" I nodded, but we both knew that wasn't true. You don't forget something like that. You can't. Later, we tried to find the dirt road again, in daylight. We drove up and down that stretch of Route 17 for hours, but there was no turnoff, no clearing, no cabin. Just endless trees and the empty highway. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I check my rearview mirror more often than I need to. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see a pale face with glowing eyes staring back at me, lips pulled back in that terrible smile. And sometimes I hear a whisper, carried on the night wind. "Almost home." I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Sarah and I still serve in the Army, though we requested different postings after that night. We keep in touch, but we rarely talk about what happened. Once, after a few too many drinks, she confessed that she sleeps with her dog tags on now, even in the shower. I understood. I wear mine too, along with a small silver cross my grandmother gave me. It's probably just superstition, but it helps me sleep at night. A few months ago, I was reading through some local history of that area and found something interesting. In 1954, a young woman went missing on that stretch of Route 17. According to the yellowed newspaper article, she was last seen wearing a white dress, trying to hitchhike home. They never found her body. But that wasn't what sent chills down my spine. It was the statement from the last person to see her alive, a truck driver who'd passed her on the road. He said there was something odd about her that he couldn't quite place, until he checked his side mirror and realized her feet were facing the wrong way. The article went on to list several other disappearances along that same stretch of road over the years. Always at night, always lone travelers, always after reporting picking up a young woman in white. I've thought about reporting what happened to us, but who would believe it? 2 soldiers spooked by a ghost story? We'd be laughed off the base. Besides, what good would it do? The thing we encountered wasn't something that could be fought with conventional weapons or tactical training. But I did do one thing. I posted a warning on a local message board, telling people not to pick up hitchhikers on that road at night. Most of the responses were jokes or skepticism, but one comment caught my attention. It was from someone claiming to be a former state trooper who'd worked that area in the 1970s. He wrote, "Listen to this warning. There are things in those woods older than our understanding. things that wear human faces like masks. If you're driving that road at night and see someone trying to get home, keep driving, because it's not their home they're heading to, and if you give them a ride, it might be the last stop you ever make. I don't know if posting that warning helped anyone. I hope it did. But I know this. If you're ever driving through upstate New York late at night and you see a young woman in white asking for a ride home, keep driving. Don't look in your rearview mirror. Don't slow down. Just drive. Because some things that look like people aren't people at all, and some homes aren't meant for the living. I learned that lesson on a cold November night, and I'll carry it with me forever, along with the memory of those glowing eyes in my rearview mirror and that voice that still haunts my dreams. Almost home. Mother is waiting. You might be wondering why I'm sharing this story now, after keeping it to myself for so long. The truth is, I saw something last week that forced my hand. I was scrolling through local news articles when I saw a familiar face. A young soldier, fresh out of training, had gone missing on Route 17. Her car was found abandoned on the side of the road, the engine still running, her phone on the passenger seat. The article included a statement from her friend, who'd been traveling with her but had stepped out to check a flat tire. According to her, they'd just picked up a young woman in a white dress who'd asked for a ride home. The friend said she'd only turned her back for a moment. When she looked again, both the woman in white and her fellow soldier were gone. They haven't been found. But here's the detail that made my blood run cold. In the soldier's last text message, sent moments before she disappeared, she wrote, "Something weird about this girl we picked up. When she walks, her feet are backwards." So I'm sharing my story now as a warning. If you're driving at night and see someone asking for a ride home, remember, not all those who wander are lost. Some are exactly where they want to be, and they're waiting for you to stop. Just keep driving. Please, just keep driving. Update. I shouldn't be writing this. It's 3 a.m. and I'm parked on the side of Route 17. I know. After everything I just wrote, what am I doing here? But Sarah called me an hour ago, her voice shaking. "I found something," she said. "About that night, about what we saw. You need to come see this." She wouldn't say more over the phone, just gave me coordinates to a spot along the highway. Said she'd meet me here. I've been waiting for 20 minutes, no sign of her car. My calls go straight to voicemail. But I keep seeing something in my peripheral vision, a flash of white among the trees, a pale face peering out from the darkness, and footprints in the gravel beside my car, footprints that seem to be facing the wrong way. The radio is playing static now, but underneath the white noise I swear I can hear voices. They're calling my name, telling me to come home. Sarah's headlights should have been here by now. Unless, oh God, there's someone standing in the road ahead. They're wearing Army combat uniform. It looks like Sarah, but the way she's standing, her feet. Message ends. This document was found on a laptop in an abandoned Subaru on Route 17 in upstate New York. If anyone has information about the whereabouts of Katie Redacted or Sarah Redacted, please contact the New York State Police. And if you're driving on Route 17 at night, just keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't offer anyone a ride home, because home isn't always where you think it is, and some rides don't end where they're supposed to. Bound by darkness, generations of supernatural inheritance. The first time I knew something was wrong was the day I found the old wooden box in my grandmother's attic. I was cleaning out her house after her funeral, a task that felt both painful and surreal. My grandmother Eleanor had always been a pillar of strength in our family, a retired high school English teacher who lived alone in a sprawling Victorian home nestled in the dense forests of upstate New York. Her passing had been sudden, unexpected, a heart attack, the doctors said, but something about the circumstances felt off. The attic was a labyrinth of memories, dust-covered photo albums, vintage clothing, forgotten furniture. Each item seemed to whisper fragments of stories long buried. When I lifted the ornate wooden box, its weight surprised me. Intricate carvings covered its surface, symbols I didn't recognize, geometric shapes intertwined with what looked like ancient runes. "My name is Michael Blackwood. I'm 28, a graduate student in anthropology, and until that moment, I thought I knew everything about my family's history. I was wrong. My fingers traced the edge of the lid. A strange sensation crawled up my spine, a mixture of curiosity and inexplicable dread. I should have left it alone, but curiosity has always been my weakness. The lock was antique, but it gave way surprisingly easily. Inside, I found a collection of documents, photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The first page was dated 1953 and bore my grandmother's maiden name, Eleanor Blackwood. Her handwriting was precise, almost clinical, a remnant of her years teaching. But the contents were anything but academic. June 15, 1953. They don't understand. The price of survival is never simple. What we did to Sarah, what my mother arranged, it was necessary. But some debts are never truly paid. A chill ran down my spine. Sarah. I knew that name. My great-aunt, who had died decades ago, rumored to have been mentally ill. No one in the family ever spoke about her in detail. The journal entries became my obsession over the next few weeks. Piece by piece, a horrifying narrative emerged. Sarah had been deemed unstable as a young woman. In an era where mental health was poorly understood, her family saw her as a burden. Marriage prospects seemed impossible. My great-grandmother, desperate to secure Sarah's future, had turned to unconventional methods. A local practitioner of dark rituals. Someone who claimed to understand energies beyond conventional understanding. For a price, he promised to heal Sarah, to make her acceptable to potential suitors. The price, as Eleanor's journal revealed, was far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The ritual required specific components, including ashes from a recent cremation and a willing sacrifice. Not of life, but of something more insidious. A spiritual transaction that would bind an entity to their bloodline, granting temporary relief while extracting a future toll. Sarah was indeed married shortly after. Her madness seemingly cured, but the entity waited, patient, calculating. As I read deeper into the journal, strange things began happening in my own life. Shadows moved when they shouldn't. Whispers echoed in empty rooms. At night, I would wake suddenly, feeling watched, an intense, malevolent presence just beyond my perception. My research led me to discover more about the practitioner my great-grandmother had consulted. His name was rarely spoken, but local historical records revealed fragments. A man known for solving difficult problems through methods that existed in the liminal space between spirituality and something far darker. I traced his origins to a small community just outside of Albany. Historical records were sparse, but local folklore spoke of a man known only as the Resolver, someone families would turn to when conventional methods failed. My academic training kicked in. I began documenting everything meticulously. The journal entries, the unexplained phenomena, the fragments of history I was uncovering. The journal's final entries were fragmented, almost manic. It wants payment, always payment. Sarah was just the beginning. Our bloodline is marked, and it will collect what it is owed. I began experiencing blackouts, moments of lost time where I would find myself in strange locations with no memory of how I'd arrived. Photographs would show me in positions I had no recollection of assuming. My body positioned unnaturally, my expression vacant and cold. My girlfriend, Rebecca, was the first to truly notice the changes. "Something's wrong, Michael," she said one night, her hand trembling as she showed me a series of photos from a recent camping trip. In each image, a dark shadow seemed to hover just behind me, almost humanoid, but not quite. Its edges were blurred, indistinct. My academic colleagues thought I was experiencing stress. Typical graduate student burnout, they said. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel the constant crawling sensation of being watched. I consulted local historians, paranormal researchers, anyone who might shed light on the cryptic journal entries and the growing sense of dread that consumed me. An elderly local historian, Margaret Chen, was the first to provide a substantive lead. She specialized in regional occult practices, particularly those dating back to the early 20th century. The practitioners of that era, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper, They understood something we've forgotten. Spiritual transactions were real, not metaphorical. Real binding contracts that could span generations. She confirmed what the journal had hinted at. Some entities didn't just possess, they negotiated. They waited. They collected. The more I discovered, the more the boundaries between my academic understanding of the world and the supernatural began to blur. My research into Sarah's life revealed increasingly disturbing details. She had been institutionalized multiple times before her miraculous healing. Medical records from the time were fragmented, but they painted a picture of severe psychological distress, hallucinations, violent outbursts, speaking in languages no one could identify. Sound familiar? Because now, those same symptoms were manifesting in me. Rebecca couldn't handle it anymore. One morning, I woke to find a note. She had left, unable to watch me spiral into what she believed was a mental breakdown. I can't watch you destroy yourself. Get help. But how do you explain help when the problem exists beyond conventional understanding? The entity, whatever it was, seemed to be growing stronger, more present, more demanding. I discovered an old photograph among my grandmother's documents. A group picture, likely taken in the 1950s. Most faces were clear, but one figure stood at the edge of the frame, blurred, almost deliberately obscured. When I examined it under a magnifying glass, I could have sworn the blurred figure was looking directly at the camera, at me. My academic advisor suggested I take a medical leave. "You're exhibiting signs of extreme stress," he said. "Your research seems to be consuming you." If only he knew. The local paranormal researcher I had initially consulted, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, provided the most comprehensive analysis. "These entities," she explained, "they're not simple ghosts or spirits. They're complex spiritual constructs, bound by intricate rules of transaction. Your great-grandmother didn't just perform a ritual, she entered a contract. The rules were clear, as outlined in Eleanor's journal. The entity would not rest until it claimed a member of the bloodline. It had been patient, waiting, observing generations. And now, it was coming for me. I tried everything. Priests, paranormal investigators, spiritual cleansings. Nothing worked. The entity's connection to our family was too deeply rooted. My only hope, according to the cryptic final pages of the journal, was to understand the original transaction, to unravel the precise spiritual contract my great-grandmother had entered into. But some mysteries are better left buried. Some inheritances are not meant to be claimed. As weeks turned into months, the manifestations became more pronounced. I would find myself in trance-like states, speaking in a language that felt ancient, guttural. Recordings I made during these episodes revealed conversations with something, negotiations, promises, threats. Margaret Chen, the local historian, became my most trusted confidant. She helped me piece together the fragmented history of the Resolver, the man my great-grandmother had consulted. His real name was Sebastian Crane. Born in 1892, he came from a long line of practitioners who existed in the shadows of conventional society. People who understood that reality was far more complex than most could comprehend. He wasn't just a mystic, Margaret explained. He was a negotiator, someone who could communicate with entities most people couldn't even perceive. The more I learned, the more I realized this was about more than just my family. These spiritual transactions were a complex ecosystem, a hidden layer of reality that most people never glimpsed. But knowing didn't make me safer. If anything, it made me more vulnerable. As the entity's presence grew stronger, physical manifestations became more frequent. Objects would move, temperatures would drop inexplicably, and always, that sense of being watched. My academic work suffered, my relationships crumbled. I became obsessed with understanding the transaction, with finding a way to break the contract. But some contracts, once signed, cannot be easily voided. The night everything changed, I was in my apartment, surrounded by research materials, photographs, historical documents, the original journal. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath became visible. And then I heard it. A voice. Not external, not internal, somewhere in between. "We've been waiting a long time, Michael. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that my time was running out. The debt would be paid, one way or another. The fellowship program where shadows choose their host. I never should have taken that fellowship in rural Vermont. The warning signs were there from the start, but like most 20-something grad students desperate for funding and experience, I ignored them all. Now, as I sit in this sterile hospital room watching my best friend Sarah thrash against her restraints, speaking in voices that aren't her own, I can't help but replay every horrible detail that led us here. It started in September 2024, when I received the acceptance email for the Echo House Educational Fellowship. The 2-year program promised hands-on teaching experience at a small private school while pursuing my master's in education. The stipend wasn't much, but it included free housing, a huge draw for someone drowning in student debt. 10 of us were selected, 6 women and 4 men, all eager to escape the crushing costs of big city living. The housing turned out to be an old Victorian mansion converted into apartments, about 3 miles from the school campus. Echo House, they called it. It sat alone at the edge of dense woods, set back from the nearest neighbors by an empty field that turned into a sea of dead grass come winter. The property manager, Mr. Harrison, seemed almost apologetic when showing us around. "It's unconventional," he said, fumbling with ancient brass keys. "But the rent's free, and beggars can't be choosers, right?" Sarah and I immediately clicked during orientation. She was the only other person who seemed to notice the odd things about Echo House, the way certain rooms felt unnaturally cold even in September heat, how the old hardwood floors would creak and groan at night as if someone was pacing, the shadows that sometimes moved when they shouldn't. The others either didn't notice or chose to ignore it, too grateful for free housing to question anything. We were assigned to different floors. Sarah got a 3rd-floor room with Lisa and Emma, while I ended up in a tiny 2nd-floor single next to the back staircase. At first, I loved having my own space. I could practice violin late at night without bothering anyone, grade papers in peace, and didn't have to deal with roommate drama. But then, the nightmares started. They always began the same way. I'd be practicing violin around midnight, the dim lamp casting my shadow on the faded wallpaper. Except it wasn't just my shadow anymore. There would be others. 3 distinct silhouettes moving independently of my own. A tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small child. I'd try to convince myself it was just tricks of the light, but deep down I knew better. The shadows were watching me. One night in late October, I woke suddenly around 3 a.m. The air in my room felt heavy, charged with static electricity. As I lay there trying to steady my breathing, I heard it, the soft sound of a child humming. It seemed to be coming from the corner near my closet. I wanted to turn on the light, to prove to myself it was just my imagination, but my body wouldn't move. The humming grew louder, accompanied by the distinct sound of small feet padding across the floor. Then I felt it, tiny, ice-cold fingers brushing against my cheek. I screamed and bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp switch. The room was empty, but my heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. I ran upstairs to Sarah's room and spent the rest of the night curled up in her spare bed, too terrified to explain why. After that night, things escalated quickly. Objects would move when no one was looking. Doors would slam shut on their own. The electricity would flicker without explanation. But the worst part was what started happening to Rachel. Rachel was one of our fellow teachers, quiet, serious, and deeply religious. She'd chosen the smallest 3rd-floor room, saying she preferred solitude. At first, we barely saw her outside of school hours. Then she started acting different. It began with small things. Sitting alone in the dark parlor late at night, muttering to herself, drawing strange symbols in her lesson plan book. We assumed it was just stress from teaching, until the night of the screaming. I was in Sarah's room working on lesson plans when we heard it. A horrific, guttural shriek from Rachel's room. We ran to check on her, but her door was locked. Through the heavy oak, we could hear multiple voices arguing. A man's deep growl, a woman's high-pitched wailing, and a child's giggle, all seemingly coming from Rachel at once. "Get back!" Sarah tried the handle again. "Rachel, open the door!" The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then Rachel spoke in her normal voice, perfectly calm. "I'm fine. Just practicing for the school play." But there was no school play. and Rachel hadn't left her room in 3 days. The next morning, I cornered Mr. Harrison in his office. "What's really going on in Echo House? And don't tell me it's nothing, we all know something's wrong here." He sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older. I was hoping this group would be different, that maybe enough time had passed. He pulled out an old newspaper clipping from his desk drawer. There was a family that lived here in the 1800s, the Eccles. Jonathan Eccles, his wife Mary, and their young son James. They were troubled. The details are murky, but apparently Jonathan became convinced his wife was unfaithful. One winter night I didn't need him to finish. The headline said it all. "Tragic murder-suicide claims local family." "The house has been difficult to maintain since then," Mr. Harrison continued. "Tenants never stay long. But the school board got it cheap, and with housing costs what they are." I ran back to warn the others, but it was too late. Rachel had completely withdrawn into herself, speaking only in whispers and spending hours staring at blank walls. The others were starting to show signs too. Lisa complained of being pushed in her sleep. Emma swore she saw a child's handprints appear in the steam on her bathroom mirror, and Mark kept finding his belongings rearranged into bizarre patterns. But Sarah was different. While the rest of us were terrified, she seemed almost fascinated. She started spending more time alone in the house, claiming she was researching its history. I'd find her having whispered conversations with empty rooms. She began writing in a journal, filling pages with cramped text in handwriting that didn't quite look like her own. "They're just lonely," she told me one night. "The Eccles family. They've been trapped here so long, watching people come and go. They just want someone to stay, someone to understand." I should have realized then how far gone she was. But I was too focused on my own fear, my own desperate plans to escape. By the time I noticed the changes in her behavior, the violent mood swings, the periods of speaking in multiple voices, the way she would stare at me with eyes that somehow weren't quite her own, it was too late. The breaking point came during midterm exams. I was grading papers in the school library when my phone buzzed with texts from Lisa. "Come back now. Sarah's lost it. She's attacking Rachel. Call 911. I broke every speed limit racing back to Echo House. By the time I arrived, 3 police cars and an ambulance were already there. Sarah had cornered Rachel in the parlor, screaming in 3 distinct voices while trying to strangle her. It took 4 officers to restrain her. At the hospital, the doctors were baffled. Sarah's vital signs were normal, but her personality seemed to fragment in and out. Sometimes she was herself, crying and confused. Other times she spoke in the deep voice of Jonathan Eccles, raging about betrayal, or Mary's soft soprano, weeping for her lost child, or little James's high-pitched giggle, asking if someone would play with him. The official diagnosis was rapid-onset dissociative identity disorder triggered by stress. But I know better. We all do. Whatever dark force lingered in Echo House had found its way into Sarah's mind, and I don't know if she'll ever fully escape it. The fellowship program was suspended pending investigation. The other fellows were relocated to temporary housing, and Echo House sits empty once again. But sometimes, driving past late at night, I swear I can see shadows moving in the windows. A man, a woman, and a child, still searching for someone to stay, someone to understand. I visit Sarah when I can, though it breaks my heart to see her this way. The doctors say she's showing small signs of improvement, but I'm not sure they understand what they're really dealing with. Sometimes, in her clearer moments, she'll squeeze my hand and whisper, "They're still waiting, you know, in the house. They'll always be waiting." And I believe her, because late at night, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I sometimes catch glimpses of familiar shadows on my walls, 3 silhouettes that shouldn't be there. And in the distance, just at the edge of hearing, I swear I can make out the sound of a child humming. The fellowship position remains open, if anyone's interested, free housing included. Just don't look too closely at the shadows, and whatever you do, don't listen when they start whispering your name. Midnight train to nowhere. The fluorescent lights of the Greyhound station in Amarillo, Texas flickered like dying fireflies as I checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. My connecting bus to Phoenix was supposed to have arrived an hour ago, but delays were nothing new on these long, lonely routes across the endless Texas panhandle. My name is Michael Reyes, and I've been traveling for 3 days straight, running from something I can't quite explain. Something that started back in my small hometown of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, and has been chasing me ever since. The station was nearly empty. An elderly janitor swept near the far wall, his movements mechanical and rhythmic. An overweight security guard sat half asleep at the main desk, his chair creaking with each shallow breath. And then there was me, a 28-year-old graphic designer with nothing but a worn backpack, a laptop bag, and a growing sense of paranoia that something was terribly, terribly wrong. It all began 2 weeks ago, when I discovered a dusty leather-bound journal hidden behind a loose panel in my grandmother Elena's attic. She had passed away 3 months earlier, leaving behind a house full of secrets and a lifetime of unspoken memories. My family's history had always been complicated. Generations of immigrants who seemed to carry some unspoken burden, a weight that pressed down on each successive generation like an invisible curse. The journal belonged to my grandfather, Roberto Reyes, a man I barely remembered. He had disappeared in 1962 when my father was just a child. Family stories were always vague. Some said he left for work and never returned. Others whispered about a mysterious accident. But the journal told a different story. His handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its careful construction. Each page was filled with meticulous notes about something he called the Pact. Cryptic references to an agreement made generations ago, something about a debt that must be repaid. Scattered throughout were strange diagrams, intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move if you looked at them too long, sketches of a train that didn't look like any locomotive I'd ever seen. The last entry was dated just days before his disappearance. They are coming. The train approaches. I cannot protect them anymore. The debt must be paid. When I showed the journal to my father, he turned pale and refused to discuss it. "Some stories are better left untold," he had said, his hands shaking slightly as he handed the journal back to me. That's when the strange occurrences began. First, it was subtle. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Reflections in windows that didn't match reality. Whispers just at the edge of hearing, speaking in a language I didn't understand, but somehow felt deep in my bones. Then came the dreams. Each night, I would find myself on a train. Not a modern train, but something ancient and timeless. Wooden panels dark with age, brass fixtures that gleamed with an unnatural light. And always, always, a sense of something watching, waiting. I tried to rationalize it. Stress from work, grief from my grandmother's death, the emotional toll of uncovering family secrets. But deep down, I knew something more was happening. The janitor's voice snapped me back to the present. "Your train is here," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. I blinked, confused. "This is a bus station. I'm waiting for a Greyhound." He continued staring, that unnatural stillness making my skin crawl. "The Midnight Limited, Platform 3, it's waiting for you." Before I could respond, the security guard also turned, his movement equally robotic. "You should go now," he added, his voice a perfect monotone match to the janitor's. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for days, ever since I discovered those old documents. Documents that spoke of a family curse, of an ancient pact made generations ago, of a debt that must be paid. I stood slowly, my heart racing. The station seemed to stretch and warp around me, perspective bending in impossible ways. The fluorescent lights pulsed, creating strobing shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. "Platform 3, the janitor repeated. "The train is waiting." My legs moved of their own accord. I knew I should run, should protest, should do anything but walk toward that phantom platform. But some unseen force pulled me forward, each step heavy with an inexorable destiny. And then I saw it, gleaming in the distorted station light, impossibly long and dark. A train that shouldn't exist. The train was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its exterior was a deep obsidian black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No windows, no visible markings. Just an impossibly long, smooth surface that curved into darkness. As I approached Platform 3, I realized the station had gone completely silent. The janitor and security guard had vanished. The fluorescent lights flickered and died, leaving only a pale, sourceless illumination that seemed to emanate from the train itself. The doors opened without a sound. I knew I shouldn't enter. Every rational thought screamed at me to turn back, to run, to do anything but step inside this impossible vehicle. But my body moved of its own accord, as if pulled by an invisible thread. The interior was massive, impossibly larger than the exterior suggested. Wooden panels stretched in impossible geometries, creating corridors and compartments that seemed to shift and change with each step. Antique brass fixtures gleamed with an inner light, casting strange shadows that moved independently of any visible source. My grandfather's journal suddenly felt heavy in my backpack. "Welcome, Michael," a voice said. I spun around. An elderly man sat in one of the compartments, dressed in a vintage 1960s suit that looked perfectly preserved. His eyes were the same deep brown as my father's, the same shade that ran through our family line. "Grandfather?" I whispered. Roberto Reyes smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile. Just a deep, ancient sadness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. "You've discovered too much," he said. "The pact cannot be broken, not after all these years." The train lurched forward, though no movement was perceptible. Outside the non-existent windows, reality itself seemed to blur and twist. "What pact?" I demanded. "What are you talking about?" Roberto's form began to shimmer, becoming translucent. "Our family made a bargain generations ago. A bargain with something that travels between worlds, something that requires payment." Fragments of memory crashed through my mind. Stories my grandmother had half told, whispers at family gatherings, the way my father's hands would shake when certain old photographs were mentioned. "In 1872, Roberto continued, "my great-grandfather Miguel Reyes was a railroad worker, building the Transcontinental Railroad across the American West. They were desperate men, immigrants, expendable." The train's interior began to change. Suddenly, I was looking at a construction site. Men in tattered clothes, their skin dark from sun and labor, laying railroad tracks across an unforgiving landscape. "They made a deal," Roberto's voice echoed. "Safe passage, protection for their families. But every generation, a sacrifice must be made." I understood then. The train wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was something else entirely. A living entity, a hungry thing that collected its toll in human lives. "You're going to make me pay the debt," I realized. Roberto's ghost smiled. "Not me. The train decides." The narrative would continue to unfold, revealing the horrifying generational curse, the supernatural nature of the train, and Michael's desperate attempt to understand and potentially escape his fate.